national minimum wage enforcement. I should say, before we move on to that actually, that one of the things we're trying to do today is get people to contribute to the meeting if they're watching online, to tweet questions or contributions to the meeting that we can share with people. The hashtag for doing that is Southwark Scrutiny, so I'll be looking on my phone to just keep an eye out for those as the meeting goes on. So if people watching at home want to make a contribution, they can do so. So moving on to national minimum wage enforcement in the borough, which is something that we agreed to take forward at our last meeting. We've got our guest speaker, which is Councillor Andy Hull. Hi Andy. Andy, if you'd like to come forward to the table here. Yes. So thank you very much for coming, Andy. Welcome to Southwark's Overview and Scrutiny Committee, and thanks for taking the time to come along. It's the reason your name cropped up is, of course, the fault of us searching around for somebody who's a real expert on this area and somebody who knows about minimum wage enforcement. We want to try and get a picture of minimum wage enforcement and problems relating to underpayment of national minimum wage in our borough, and to make some suggestions to our cabinet about how we might improve that situation. The thing that particularly took my notice was the report that you authored for the Trust for London on national minimum wage enforcement, I think a couple of years ago now, which had some really excellent suggestions in there, not just for councils but also for national government about changes which might take place. The way we normally do things is just if you could just say a few words about the work that you've done in this area, anything in particular that you would like to highlight, and then I'm sure members of the committee got lots of questions. I know I have. This is our first session on this issue, so we haven't actually done any work on it yet. So this is kind of our introductory session.
That's good. So I'm going to start from the top then.
Go ahead.
Not too much knowledge. If I 5 minutes, okay?
Yeah, that's brilliant. That's fantastic.
First of all, thank you for having us here today. It is a couple of years since I wrote this report, which is called Settle for Nothing Less, Enhancing National Minimum Wage Compliance and Enforcement, which is for the Centre for London and was funded by Trust for London, and do download it. It's all online if you're interested to find out more.
We have got it in our papers,
Great.
so everybody should have had a look at it.
Fantastic.
Great.
So the national minimum wage now is over 15 years old. I think it was one of the more important innovations in the British political economy in many years. But sadly, at least 300,000 people in the UK today still work for less than it. That's something like £533 million of wages would be owed to those earning below it. And that's 1% of jobs in the labour market. So it's a not insignificant proportion of those who work are getting paid less than their legal minimum entitlement. It's enforced by Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs on behalf of the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills. And they have 10 teams across 17 locations around the country, and it costs about £8 million to the taxpayer for that enforcement operation, which currently identifies about £4 million a year of arrears owed to people. So you might argue it's not the best value for money, because it's costing twice as much as it's identifying by way of arrears. HMRC does also impose fines on organisations caught paying less than the minimum wage, and on pretty rare occasions it brings prosecutions into court against them. In terms of its work, 60% of what it does is reactive, so there's something called the Pay and Work Rights Helpline. If somebody thinks they're being paid less than they're entitled, they can ring that helpline, or if a third party is concerned on their behalf, they can call, so trade unions will often phone the line, you can phone it as a council. 60% of HMRC's enforcement work is reactive, that's based upon those phone calls coming into the Pay and Work Rights Helpline. 40% of HMRC's minimum wage enforcement work is proactive, so that's HMRC targeting sectors in the economy and areas in the country that it thinks there's a problem with, and going and doing some intensive work in those areas. So there's both reactive and proactive work. And there are problems with minimum wage non-payment in all sorts of parts of the economy. So some examples would be home carers. I'd say a very large number of them, and lots of the numbers I've seen, I think, are underestimates. I'm talking to people who are expert academics in this field, but large numbers of home carers not getting paid for the time they spend travelling from one appointment to another, which means that effectively over the course of the day they're getting paid less than the minimum wage. And that's not for their travelling to work first thing in the morning or back home last thing at night. That's for all the inevitable travel they have to do in between appointments. There are plenty of areas, not least hairdressing, where apprenticeships are often rolled on year after year when they're meant to come to an end after their first year, and you're meant to get more money after that. So there's a problem there. There's a problem with unpaid internships. Organisations in politics and in the media are particularly guilty, I think, of setting up a system whereby when you first want to get in, often as a young applicant, you're required to do an internship. Often those internships don't pay, and that, I think, is a kind of structural inequality that locks out a lot of people who either don't live in London or can't afford to work for months on end unpaid. Hotel cleaners, I think 10% of the country's hotel rooms are in London, and hotel cleaners are another group who often get paid less than the minimum wage, largely because they're paid per room rather than per hour, so unless you can clean really fast you can't earn minimum wage, and who often don't get paid for the communal areas because they're paid per room. You don't get paid for a stairwell or a landing, and yet of course that takes time to clean. So there's a number of areas where this is a problem. It's worse in the capital than in most places. So the Low Pay Commission, which is a pretty authoritative, if conservative body on this subject, says that there's 7 London boroughs in which the percentage of workers paid the minimum wage or less rises above 5%. And in somewhere like Newham, they've done quite a useful report more recently called Pay by the Rules that I'd suggest you have a look at.
Great.
In Newham, they reckon themselves that 70% of those working in the borough get paid less than the minimum wage, which is a huge proportion when you think about it. London's particularly affected by this, partly because of the concentration of particular sectors, so I mentioned 10% of hotel rooms are here, but also to the concentration of the migrant population here in London. Migrants for various reasons are particularly susceptible to this sort of exploitation and abuse. So one of the things I worked on at the Centre for London was some possible solutions to these problems. Some of them we've been able to act upon as a council, others would require government change policy. In terms of something we could do as a council, we built into our home care contracts, because those contracts are delivered by a third-party contractor on our behalf. We don't do in-house home care provision. We built into those contracts a schedule which requires the minimum wage at least to be paid for hours worked, both contract time and travel time. And you might think it ironic that you have to build a requirement in your contract that someone obey the law of the land. But interestingly, it seems to me that they're much more scared of punitive clauses in contracts that mean financial penalties than a law that's barely enforced by a government that's not interested. And so there is actually value in building into a contract, even if it's already the law. I think having a very low first-year rate for minimum wage for apprentices is unhelpful, and we should get rid of it. I think advertising non-voluntary roles for work at less than the minimum wage should be something that the government bans. I think it would be useful if employers, by their part, by publishing the number for the Pay and Work Rights Helpline in all their pay slips, for instance, so that, because there is a problem here which is about information and awareness and people being exploited knowing what their recourse is and who to turn to, etc. I think it's a problem that at the moment the arrears are repaid to workers by the company that's breached the law, and I think there's all sorts of reasons why that might be difficult for the workers involved. I think it would be better if the arrears were channeled back to them through HMRC or an independent third party. The government has raised the ceiling on fines that can be imposed upon companies found to be in breach of this law, but I think it could be raised further still or got rid of. I'm not sure why you need a ceiling on the fines, given the way they're worked out. And I just hope that all repeat offenders on this front should be prosecuted. I can't see any reason why we should let companies that do this time and again off the hook. Government is better now at naming and shaming companies, of course, out than it had been. For a long time, there was the list, you could count on one hand the number of organisations that had actually been named and shamed, despite umpteen announcements by various government ministers that they would publicly shame those organisations. There's more of that now. And I think there's a problem with the publicity budget around the minimum wage is too low and think could be increased, because I do think that general levels of awareness aren't high enough. If local authorities are going to do more on this, then I think we might need a more relaxed approach to information sharing from HMRC, because without some of the intel that they have, it's quite difficult for local authorities to know how to act. But the main recommendation we made in this report, which did make it into the Labour Party manifesto for the general election, and you can take your own view on how much use that is now, that was that we should localise or devolve responsibility for minimum wage enforcement largely to the local authority level, because councils are so much closer to the ground. We know the visitors in our area, both the good ones and the bad ones. We already have to deal with them on waste disposal and planning and licensing and a whole raft of other regulatory issues, and it seems to me, and to us at Centre for London, that exploited workers will get a better deal out of local authorities than they do from HMRC. So obviously Labour didn't win that election. It wasn't in the Conservative manifesto. Maybe a Conservative party government could be convinced to devolve that responsibility, but there's no sign of it as yet.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's really useful. I'm going to jump in with a few questions, but if members of the committee want to indicate to me, then I'll talk with Rosie and then Mead and Johnson first. Okay. The way I see this in terms of the scrutiny that we're going to carry out is that we've got two jobs. First of all, we need to get a picture of what is going on in our borough. You know, where are the problems with underpayment and national minimum wage, which obviously is completely unacceptable. And then also there's, you know, what things can we do differently in order to improve that situation, if indeed we do find that there's a problem, which I suspect that we will, but that obviously remains to be seen. So on the first of those two questions, okay, I'm just trying to pick your brain a little bit. You've got a bit of knowledge of what's happened in Newham, obviously you've done work in Islington on this. What is the best way for a council to kind of start identifying where the real problem areas are with underpayment and national minimum wage?
A good place to start might be asking good employers in whose vested interest it is to build in the bad ones. So, because you're unlikely to get people coming forward admitting this, but their competitors have an interest in, and often they'll have kind of community intelligence that they'll keep a close eye on what their rivals are doing, and they might well come to learn if workers are being paid less than minimum wage at the rival shop down the road. So that's one place, and you could try and facilitate a discussion along those lines through your local chamber of commerce or another appropriate business forum. But I think if it's not a bit counterintuitive, going to the good businesses in the first instance to ask about the bad ones might be a place to start. And I think, trying to extract anything you can from HMRC by way of relevant local intel, but in my experience they're pretty tight-lipped. They think that they've got a lot of data sharing limitations that they have to work with, and you're unlikely to get them saying, yes, we're worried about this place, and this place, or we've had phone calls from this employer, this employer, and this employer.
Yeah.
They're pretty tight-lipped about all of that.
Yeah.
I mean, you'll have people coming into your customer centre or the equivalent every day for a whole raft of issues, and I don't know how much you talk about employment matters with them there or through your local citizens advice bureau, but it could be built into a standard kind of set of questions that get asked as clients come to your help with basic services. If you're in work, are you confident in getting paid at least this much? And if you ask enough people that question, you might well find some saying no. Yeah. So there's a volume approach anyway. If you try and cast the net wide and just ask everyone who comes through your door, maybe you'll surface a few businesses where there's an issue. But either one you have, it's then not a simple matter of acting on the employees or the workers' behalf without their consent. You can land people in trouble that way and they might not appreciate it. So you're going to have to build their confidence to ring this distant remote phone line, because that's pretty much the only way to get it out of the job these days. And so you might want to find out a bit more about how that phone line and how it works and who starts it and what happens as a result, so that you can be honest with someone about what they can expect to see happening down the line if they do consent to either phone themselves or have you to do it on their behalf. Yeah,
now that leads in quite nicely to my second question, which is the other side of it, what extra stuff we can do. I mean, I have myself given the hotline a call to actually speak to one of them and just talk them through the process. And the thing I asked about was, how third-party reporting is dealt with. And it seemed to me from the conversation that I had, and thankfully the guy was really open and honest and prepared to talk to me about it, was that he said that third-party reports are treated as intelligence, and sometimes that's acted on and sometimes it isn't. Whereas obviously people who are reporting it on behalf of themselves, it automatically starts an investigation. But I did come come away with the impression that actually if a third party reports it, in this case it was me, but if a council took it upon itself to start regularly reporting this kind of thing, that it kind of feels a bit, as you say in your report, like it's going into a hole, and you're worried that it's not really going to get acted upon. Is that a fair reflection of what's going on, do you think?
It is, but there aren't many places to go besides that hole. That's the problem.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't have the power of the council to enforce this yourself, so you need HMRC to do it, and the only way they want to hear about it is through that phone line. I do think they act upon third-party reports, but it's definitely deprioritised compared to first-hand reporting. And I suspect that if you were able to dig under the surface, you'd find that not every third-party report had been acted upon. So you're right, there's a catch-22 there, but in lieu of councils being given the power to do some of this stuff themselves, you're going to have to go through that route. But I couldn't hand on heart say that every third-party report is acted upon swiftly, because I think, as you say, it's not. But again, I had to ask so many FOI and parliamentary questions to get any of this information, because it's pretty tightly held, and that's part of the problem. The system's, in my view, dysfunctional. It's hard to prove that when it's so unaccountable and there's so little information available.
You said, rightly you say that councils don't have the powers to enforce this. Presumably there's nothing stopping a council, say, retail is a problem area, for low pay. There's nothing stopping a council. Sometimes councils already do sweeps on, in local shopping areas, on health and safety, fire safety stuff. Presumably there's nothing stopping a council sending in officers to a local area, talking to people who are employed in those businesses and asking them whether or not they're paid the national minimum wage. And the only sanction that would be open to the council is to say to the business owner, we are going to ring the hotline. But presumably there's nothing stopping a council doing that.
No, recognising you've got no powers beyond those of the ordinary citizen, you're perfectly entitled to go into every business in Southwark and ask people who work there, what are you paid? And some of them will tell you, and a few of them might say less than the minimum wage. So yes, and I think that kind of, it might feel a bit, I think, simplistic or whatever else, but your options are limited. I think it's not a bad idea. The best place you can start is perhaps a conversation. And when I did lots of living wage campaigning, that's how I began. I wandered into a Tesco's and started chatting to some people stacked at some shelves about them and their life and their work, and then you got onto their pay. And after 2 or 3 visits, you started to build up some rapport and some trust, and down the line, you were campaigning together. So, unorthodox as it might feel, I think there probably is a case for some of that. Just kind of stuck it and see, get stuck in and see what you find out.
Okay, I'm going to stop for now. So, Rosie.
Actually, my question's partly probably been already answered, but obviously, as you say, official responsibility, and the only people that can actually sanction employers lies with HMRC, and obviously there's little that we can do as a council in terms of actual action and sanctions. But I was interested in what you said about the potential to localise this, and so I suppose I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about either what you kind of came across as part of your report, or just generally in your work in this area, about any examples of best practice by councils to try and kind of raise awareness of maybe amongst workers of their rights, or to kind of lead on best practice, or or engaging with businesses in the way that Gavin suggested as part of his question. I don't know if it might be all in the Newham report that you mentioned, but if there are any other examples.
Yeah, Hackney Council put up a load of posters around Hackney saying, here's what the minimum wage is, here's the phone number to call if you're not getting it, please ring. And I thought that was a good thing for them to be doing. Newham have invited HMRC to come on a number of multi-agency raids across the borough. They tend not to be just about minimum wage and its enforcement. They include things like immigration enforcement, so they've had the Home Office's Immigration Enforcement Directorate come along, and those police officers, council officers, and then they've swept whole streets, or they've decided to focus on a particular sector, like chicken shops, and going to a number of them an evening. And I think they have, in those cases, found some people getting paid less than the minimum wage and being able to amplify that way. That's quite a in-your-face kind of route, I'd say. It's one that we've shied away from in Islington, but I think, to be fair to you, they have identified some minimum wage underpayment. They've probably found some of the same people who maybe owe more wages but are now on a plane or a boat being deported as well. So depends on your take on immigration enforcement as well, I guess, about how you approach that. But I'd say that Newham's been by far the most proactive on this stuff, and Robin in Wales was mayor is very keen on this idea of councils having more power to enforce the minimum wage. I think he's probably got more of a problem with its underpayment than most as well. And those statistics I find mind-boggling, really. 17% of workers in Europe getting paid less than the minimum wage. But there isn't much by way of good practice in the local authorities out there, because our powers are so limited. Happy in Newham is where I start, and their report is worth a read.
Anita.
Thanks very much, Andrew. It's really good, and obviously a huge amount of work sort of 2 years ago, and it doesn't sound like sort of very much has happened with it, so still issues, and obviously I imagine any more up-to-date data would say similar thing. And that's what I wanted to talk about really, because in your table on page 36 of our agenda, you've got the list of boroughs. And just one very brief question. Where did 61 of your reports? 61 of your reports, so yeah. Where does the Newham 17% figure come from then? So these
are figures from the Low Pay Commission.
Yeah.
The 17% figures from Newham Council itself, which thinks it's got better, more up-to-date data than the LPC.
Okay, because that was 2012 as well. Okay.
So you're right, there's a discrepancy between the two, but I've met with the Newham people doing this research on a number of occasions, and it strikes me that their methodology is fairly rigorous, so I'd be surprised if it's...
I can believe.
Orders are trying to cheat out.
Just, what was their methodology?
There's an appendix in here that's in there, but a lot of it was more qualitative than quantitative, so they did quite a number of in-depth interviews with individual workers. But I've had to extrapolate, I suppose, to an extent from that, because they certainly haven't asked every resident or every worker in Newham how much they get paid. But I think there's a mixture of qualitative and quantitative methodologies, but they're not perfect, so they didn't sound outright flexible either, and that's probably the best you can hope for in this kind of environment.
Yeah, because that's why I was interested, because obviously then it gives us a rough idea of how many people in Southwark we're talking about, which is that 2.3%.
The Newham figure is probably at the higher end of the realistic spectrum. The LPC figure, I suspect, is at the more conservative.
At the lower end, yeah. So it's somewhere.
So you're probably somewhere between.
Because what I was going to ask is kind of, obviously that's quite a, whoever's figures you take, there's quite a big range. And where the differences in different boroughs come from. So, for example, that 2.3% in Southwark, where might it be? Because I'm just trying to sort of picture, I think some boroughs, for example, you mentioned the Brick Lane in the report, and you can kind of, that makes sense geographically in terms of where Tower Hamlets, is Brick Lane in Tower Hamlets? Yeah. So that kind of then makes sense to me, all right, that's there. And I'm just trying to get a picture of where it is in Southwark, or why there's such a difference in boroughs.
I think things like restaurants, hotels, hairdressing, they're obvious places to go. They won't cover everyone, and there'll be minimum wage non-payment in other places as well, but you've got to start somewhere, and you could usefully start in those places, because all the research I've read suggests that they're areas where there's definitely a problem.
I just wondered why Haringey and Waltham Forest are at 6% and Southwark's at 2%. I don't know whether any of the work you did gave any more about that. Just curious.
No, not particularly. And I think you need to bear in mind too that these figures from the LPC are people paid at or below the minimum wage, and obviously there's no legal problem with being paid at the minimum wage. Whereas the Newham figure is specifically people paid below the minimum wage. So you're talking about 2.3% of Southwark, according to the LPC in 2012, being paid at or below the minimum wage. So the figure for people being paid below it is less than that figure. For the population. But you're still talking about a decent number of people that it's worth trying to identify as that.
But actually maybe the first bit of work is trying to actually get a sense of the numbers the way Newham's done.
Yeah.
And I just quietly mentioned to the chair it'd be really good for that Newham report to be...
Yeah, if this scrutiny is going to continue for a while, I'd get Newham to come, because some of their work's more recent than mine, and whilst mine was kind of pan-London, they've really gone into some detail in one borough, which maybe is useful to hear.
Was there one individual in particular that we should get from Newham?
A lady called Jemima, who's head of their policy team.
Great.
Get your head inside us.
Brilliant. Thank you. Johnson.
Yeah, just echo colleague Paul. Thank you, Andy, for joining us today. Just a couple of questions in terms of, you're quite right, you mentioned that particularly for some of the vulnerable members of society and some vulnerable residents, being able to call in the number might be quite difficult because it might have different repercussions. Particularly, so immigration aside, or they might be vulnerable for a number of reasons.
Yeah.
What would be your thoughts in terms of having anonymity in terms of calling in, and would that be effective, and particularly for councils to be able to put that across, or local authorities to be able to put that across and say, you know, whatever your circumstances, this needs to be called in essentially, and to what degree that would be effective. Secondly, particularly with respect to hairdressers, hairstylists, one way from anecdotal, I particularly feel people have been able to get around it is by having those employees as self-employed business owners. So having them, they're not really business owners, but they are like essentially renting the business from them. So how could we get around that little clause in terms of making someone working for a hairdresser as a business owner as opposed to an employee? Yeah, how would you?
Okay. So,
Yeah, go for it.
I mean, anonymity is a real challenge because you can't guarantee it. Because at the end of the day, if they've been paid less than minimum wage, they're entitled to some arrears, and the company needs to know to what employees they should pay those arrears. So, you know, they're going to find out. There's no way of anonymising that. You can offer them either support through that process, and the first thing you might do is get in touch with a relevant trade union if they're a member of one or eligible to be one, and support them through it so that there are not repercussions for them. They may or may not believe that the trade union or the councillor or council officer can protect them from those repercussions, but the least you can do is to offer that kind of support, because obviously it would be illegal for an employer to sanction them in any way for ringing that phone line, but that isn't to say they won't be afraid that's going to happen with others. And it might be that you can offer them the sort of support that gives them the confidence to make the call all the same, but you definitely can't say to them, you can do this anonymously and we can do it as a third party, because at the end of the day, if they're going to get any money back, you know, they're going to have to disclose their name. But you know, I suspect there are plenty of people out there who are being paid less than the minimum wage and are afraid to grass in their employers, for want of a better phrase, which is a bit depressing because it feels like the bad guys winning, but I don't know a simple way around it, unless, I suppose, theoretically you could make a complaint without seeking the arrears. You know, the person could do it for the sake of their colleagues, etc. Maybe that's possible, I hadn't really thought about that, but if at the end of the day they were happy not to get the money back, then maybe you could keep their name quiet. It might be quite difficult, I think, given all the steps HMRC has to go through to investigate things, because they're going to have to ask for those files are going to have names on. I think doing it kind of incognito would be really quite difficult. On the self-employed point, I think there's a wider issue there about, yes, perhaps avoiding paying minimum wage, but tax avoidance as well, and there are lots of areas now where the agency staff that Southwark Council use, and we use a number ourselves. I think you'll find that a growing proportion of them are now presenting as limited companies or other kind of clever ways of avoiding paying tax. And it's not just the high-end agency workers like, I don't know, your architects or lawyers, it's volume agency activity as well now, where people are presenting as carers or whatever as limited companies. That's something that will require probably national government response, not just the local council. We've mooted whether we could refuse to take people who apply on that kind of basis as a council. I've been told that if we did that we wouldn't get a filled social worker post or a post that we funded to the press. So you're going to need some sort of coordinated action on that. Whether it's about tax avoidance in that context or minimum wage avoidance in the context you raised, strikes me they're both things that probably require legislative change.
Good.
Thank you.
Tom?
Thanks, Gavin. So Nude asked most of what I wanted to ask about the table. But one thing I was interested in was whether or not you think these numbers, what direction they might have gone in with so are we seeing more workers below the minimum wage now than we were in 2012? Have economic circumstances determine that? And just one question as well on London boroughs and enforcement. Just wondering how you would ensure consistency across London boroughs. Would we be talking ring-fence money for this to make sure that councils in very, very difficult times financially weren't ducking that and moving the money somewhere else in order to say things that they already do?
I think, given the government did finally heed calls to raise the level of fines, which happened since this report was published, I think if you now said to local authorities that they could keep the fines whilst the arrears of course go to the worker, then it could not only be self-financing but could generate a small income stream for the council, which would align interest then, which give you a best solution to the council in doing it. You're right, as with any devolutionary proposal, you'll get the kind of post-lottery concerns and what about the council but don't take these responsibilities seriously. So incentivising it financially would be one way to address that, and given the increased funds, I think that could work if you could assure the council that if it's bothered to get stuck in on this one, see what the fines coming in. Has this got better or worse since this report was published? I mean, it's not been that long since it's come out, so I'd be surprised if the numbers have shifted a great deal. I'm not an expert economist, so it would be guesswork if I must go on that. But from having read stuff from over the last 5 or 10 years on this front, I haven't seen sizable fluctuations in the numbers, so I suspect that you're talking about a fairly constant picture. Well, no doubt there was fluctuation, but I'd be surprised if this was, now many percentage points away from true.
Okay. Great, thank you. Gavin?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you very much for this report. I mean, it really is groundbreaking stuff. I was just having a quick look on Google, and there's so many references. You've done some really excellent work. It's all out there. But one thing that I couldn't find was a link between this and open data, because the stuff around social workers, in London, they're at a premium, well, allegedly, because basically they move from, one local authority to another, unsurprisingly. But, I just wonder, with the HMRC, you've got this, on the one hand, you've got them not wanting to share information, and that's something new for us, because health don't want to share information, no one wants to share it, but, you've got this big movement underpinning, open data movement, and I think that's something that you might find helpful, really, to have the synergy between the work that you're doing with the open data movement. The fact that you've got a cohort of workers, which, everyone's desperate for, I think basically, you can do the math, that should be quite successful, I'd have thought. So, there was that, I wondered if you'd thought about that or done anything on that. The other points I wanted to make was the stuff around apprenticeships. I'm very interested in that, and most local authorities are. It's like quite the big idea in terms of helping young people into education, employment and training. I wondered really if you had anything further to say on that, because on the one hand we've got a charter in Southwark, so I think hopefully we're ahead of the curve, to say about the minimum wage, and we've got a number of initiatives. But then on the other end, when we're actually talking to more companies to get more apprenticeships, you've got this issue of the interns, and then companies like, some in the city, but not all, but companies advertising like BBH, where young people, obviously from certain backgrounds, will work for nothing, and that culture's still perpetuated.
Let Andy come back on that.
All right, sorry.
That's all right.
Okay.
Well, we're a bit struggling for time because we've got a lot of people, so we'll leave it at that, Jasmine, and hand over to Andy.
I mean, I think your ideas on open data are really good, and I'll try and take them away because I haven't done it yet, but it's a source of information and intelligence on this that strikes me these days would be well worth tapping, so thank you for that idea. On care, it's a real source of frustration for me and lots of people in the care industry, but even though the government's been told lots of times that this is a real problem area, very little's being done. So a few care companies have had their knuckles wrapped for this, but it's by no means the case that despite the government being well aware of the issue, it's now being stamped out. I mean, there are still carers on their land not getting paid for their travel time, and there are individual care workers have had some arrears, and individual companies have got into a bit of bother, but there's no systemic fix that's been developed, and so I think it's kind of doubly depressing when you've told the government about the problem and you've got a sense that it's a problem that's operating at scale. Some really good academic work got on at King's to try and model the scale of this problem in care, and we're talking hundreds of thousands of people who I think are doing the most important work in our society. And the government hasn't seen that bothered, or the HMRC hasn't seen that bothered, and they investigated a couple of firms. And, I think local authorities would do a better job of that if we were given the power to. It does pose a problem of organisations that operate across borough boundaries, obviously. Not every employer works in just one London borough. There are different ways you might approach that. When it comes to health and safety, you kind of have a lead authority. So Islington, for instance, is the legal authority for Yo Sushi, for example. So whenever Yo Sushi have health and safety issues around the country, then they come to Islington Council to sort them out. And you could do something similar with minimum wage enforcement, because there's lots of chains, aren't there? Lots of national and international businesses, and you need an approach to them, so that you don't have, 100 different approaches to Sainsbury's, for instance. You mentioned, I think, ethical care charter for your carers, which I think you and I were. Your borough and our borough were the two that initially signed up to that. That does have in it the need to pay carers properly for their care time. So
that's living wage, isn't it?
Yeah.
So
if we could support union brothers and sisters in unison to get more councils to sign up to that would be a good thing. It obviously goes beyond just minimum wage, the living wage, as you said, but it doesn't just cover pay, it covers other things as well. But still very many too few councils have signed up to that ethical care charter. And after the initial couple of early adopters in your borough and mine, the list is not a long one of organisations, boroughs that have signed up.
Okay, great, thank you. Rebecca.
Thanks, Andy. I had a couple of questions about kind of putting clauses in contracts as something that at least kind of puts a marker down that we want people in the borough who will pay the national minimum wage. How effective do you think it is? Do you think it actually means that contractors will pay any attention to it? Do you think they actually will do something about it? And have you looked into anything about kind of local kite marking or incentives for businesses that are seen as good businesses for employers as well?
We've invited carers and businesses to rather worthwhile any care firms that are not paying them for their travel time, because having signed this charter, instead of doing this, we don't want to find out down the line that actually, unbeknownst to us, we're not. So we felt the best way to guarantee that was to publicly say and to let our contractors know that we were saying this, that anyone who felt they were being exploited in that way should get in touch. And we've had a couple of people ring up querying a couple of things, and it's become apparent when we've investigated that they are indeed being paid at least the minimum wage for their travel time, or living wage. So we're not aware of any examples in Islington of those contractual requirements having been breached. But I suppose it's theoretically possible that a carers out there not getting paid their living wage and not telling us about it. But I'd be surprised, because we're trying to make it very easy for them to tell us, and we're encouraging through unions and others that they do take up that offer. Kite marks, I'm wary of kite marks because I think they only really work well when they're kind of single issue, and I think they work less well when there's a proliferation of them. So we did this fairness commission thing in Islington, and one of its recommendations was a kite mark that said, here's the 10 things we want a good business to do, and let's get people who tick all those boxes a logo they can put in their window. And the comeback we got from the business community was, can you know, stop dithering you politicians, pick one thing you care about and we'll do it, but don't try and get us to do 10 different things at once in the middle of a global recession, etc. You know, it's difficult enough running my little business without you to give me a long list of things. So, and in this instance, we have gone to push the living wage thing quite hard, which I think is a very simple thing for a business to get its head around. There's obviously things like fair trade as well, but I'd be wary of something that appeared like a shopping list, which you can easily get into because everyone around the table thinks they want this for a business and that for a business and another thing for a business, and it quickly can balloon. And I'm not sure that things like you can't mark on minimum wage was, I'm not sure if that would be useful, because I think the council will be criticised for developing something that simply asks people to do what the law tells them they have to do. So I think there is a good case for sort of contractual work that I mentioned, because as I said before, they're really not scared of being caught out by HMRC because they just don't believe they're going to come knocking.
Yeah.
But they really are worried about losing multi-million-pound contracts. And that's just one of very few levers you can grab. And there aren't many of the areas I've listed where they're council services, but care is one of them. You therefore do have a bit of power.
Okay. Thank you. Maisie.
Thank you. Thanks again for your presentation. I wanted to ask, on a kind of practical level, it feels like this issue falls into two areas really. One are the kind of big national issues, kind of campaign type devolution issues. The other are the more kind of short-term practical things that potentially we can do. Obviously, we were just talking about contracts or current marks. You mentioned in your report about kind of upskilling council workers, and I was wondering in a sort of in the short term what could be done within the council, like where would you focus, or perhaps from your experience in Islington or the work that you've done, where in the short term we could focus on ourselves as a council, where and how would you upskill the council, and if in so doing that means that HMRC is suddenly flooded with loads more of these reports, do you think that will make the enforcement better, or could it make it worse, or what sort of impact do you think that would have if we were to do a programme like that within the council?
Yeah. Well, you could definitely do worse than make sure all of your outward-facing staff who do have face-to-face contact with, so that punters knew what the minimum wage rates were, knew what the phone number was to call. That would be a basic place to start. Because the minimum wage rates are not actually as simple as many think. It's not like it's just one rate, and once you know that number you're fine. There's loads of different rates for people of different ages and apprenticeships of different time periods, which I think itself is part of the problem. But I certainly wouldn't worry about flooding HMRC with phone calls. That's definitely their problem, not yours. And if they need to be better resourced, fine, give them, we should make a case for that. I think if you're going to go one step further and you're going to encourage your employees to start asking people about how much they're paid, then you just need to do it sensitively, because you could easily wind a lot of people up if you go about that the wrong way. And if you look at the council like you think you're somehow entitled to that information because you're not, you're asking people because you want to help them, but you can't demand it of them. And it's easy for everyone in this room to kind of nod that you're not in direct control of 5,000 of your employees out there. And I'd just be a bit wary of how you ask them to do that. Otherwise you might start getting a sort of complaints here, never mind HMRC about your workers going around demanding people.
It's also raising expectations of what you can do to help.
So it's a difficult one to get the right balance, but I'm sure your staff are tactful and diplomatic.
So the officers always do what the OV and Scrutiny Committee ask them to do straight away. Yeah. Good, thank you. Catherine.
Thank you. In your recommendations, one of the ones that you highlighted around houses of multiple occupation where they're employer landlords. I just wondered whether you'd actually done much work about that, because you mentioned that it's something that's within the power of a borough, London Borough. Is that something that you've explored in Islington, and how easy is it to identify employer landlords in that way?
Yeah. We have done quite a lot of work on HMOs, but it tends not to have been on this front. Like lots of boroughs in London have been looking at more intensive licensing regimes and We've particularly focused on poor quality accommodation and how we can crack down on that. To be honest, we haven't yet, I think, thought hard about how we might incorporate some of this work around wages into that approach. We're just about to bring in dedicated licensing schemes for Caledonia Road and Holloway Road, which is two of the streets where we've got the biggest problem with really substandard private rented sector accommodation. So maybe I'll speak to my colleagues, James, who's in housing, about whether we could build this in as a kind of thread of it. I think the main problem with landlords who are also employers is about the discount they're allowed to apply to the wages they pay, off the back of the fact that they offer a roof over the head. And I think that is built into the legislation that if you're providing someone with accommodation, then you don't have to pay them as much in wages. What isn't really covered in legislation is how many people you can cram in a room, or how habitable that accommodation needs to be. But I think it's more of a problem, if I'm honest, in settings like agriculture, rural settings where the farmer has a load of migrants come in to pick his strawberries or her strawberries and stick them all in the barn, etc. I mean, so I'm not aware of being quite such a problem here in London. There's no doubt a problem with lots of rubbish accommodation and poor people crammed into it, but I'm not sure in London those landlords tend to also be their employers.
Paul. Thank you. I mean, in my day-to-day work, as Andy knows, I was responsible for looking at the national minimum wage for the workers who I represent, and I think that what you said about a third party reporting is entirely true, particularly when the status of workers or employees indeed is ambiguous, like Johnson said. And it seems that actually incentives for HMRC to chase them down other than the national minimum wage, in particular tax avoidance, is something that they're particularly excited about, because that's the way I understand the enforcement. It also makes it cheaper for them to do so because they can rely on other departments within HMRC to do it. Do you have any experience of the financial information that we receive as councils, perhaps as rent in council-owned properties, or falling behind on business rates, those kinds of information, and whether that helps pick up anybody, and whether HMRC will be happy to be involved in that? And then as a second question, which follows on from something that Rebecca said, in terms of contract, obviously there are the services that we deliver, and both directly through third parties that we can look at and look at contracts, but there are also the places that we own, and later on the agenda we're looking at properties that we have, writing into those sorts of contracts for businesses whose services and deliveries have nothing to do with us. I think in particular, perhaps, say, pick a random idea, theatres who may or may not be paying it. Have Islington or anybody else looked at that? How legal is it? How possible has it been?
Yeah, we've looked into it with a slightly different angle with the living wage taxes. So could we recover living wage landlord taxes in our commercial estate? We insist that a private enterprise or a charity, for that matter, that wants to lease out our property only does so if it pays all of its staff the living wage, and that's definitely possible. There's no reason why the landlord can't insist on that. It might slightly limit the pool of people who want to take regular leases, but in central London you still have a queue. So I can't see any reason why you couldn't do the same with the minimum wage. You encounter the same communications challenge, which is that people will say, well, wait a minute, isn't that the law anyway? Why do you need to make a big hoo-ha about it, or develop a policy, or write an extra clause in your contracts? But maybe if you explain to people that it being written down in law really isn't enough to make it happen, they won't understand it, because that's the fact of it. So yeah, you definitely could, and if Southwark Council owns buildings that are being leased by theatres who are not paying all of their the minimum wage, then you could definitely have a thought build it into your contract with those theatres. You know better than I do, but I imagine theatre is one part of the arts where this is a real problem. So yeah, I think that thinking when you're grasping for what levers do we possibly have that we can pull on it, your role as a landlord is an important one.
Great. Tom, did you have a suggestion about something we might pursue in terms of levers to pull?
I was interested really, when you're talking about contracts, and putting penalties into contracts, I immediately thought that, we've got various construction contracts for our 11,000 council homes.
Yeah, we're building one.
And you did touch in here on construction. And so I just suddenly thought that's maybe something we as a committee should be suggesting to check and see whether it's there, and if not, I think that's a clause that should be in there.
Yeah, definitely. Okay.
Can I ask
Yeah,
a
go ahead.
question? I thought we already did put something about the living wage in our contract.
Yeah. So we're a accredited living wage employer, as Islington is. So presumably that means that all of the construction companies that provide the build for us are also living wage employers. One would assume, otherwise.
They are, but I think what we're hearing is useful in as much as it would tie to that requirement some serious penalties. So at the moment, if you find out that someone you've got a contract with isn't paying a living wage, the worst that can happen to them is that they lose their living wage time mark or whatever.
Yeah.
Whereas you could explicitly build into a contract that if they're found not paying a living wage, they'll lose the contract or they'll lose X £100,000 or whatever it might be. So I think it allows you to build just more serious sanctions that they might take more seriously.
Good. I'm going to take three more contributions, and then that's it for this session. All right. So Anu first, then Paul, and then go ahead.
Just can you do that on the living wage as well as the minimum wage? That penalties point.
Yeah, you probably could. I mean, it would obviously have to be it's difficult to do it retrospectively, so you can do it when you're negotiating the contracts. But I think in theory, at contract negotiation stage, you can build in within pretty much what you like. So you could do that. I don't know
that would be
whether the market would go for it or not. I don't know.
Okay.
Cool.
I mean, a comment on Tom's suggestion. I mean, in construction is also an area where the status of workers / employees, going back to what we were talking about with hairdressers, is particularly ambiguous, as with hairdressers and be actors. So perhaps it may well be worthwhile just simply asking for some reporting about how many people they have on their books working for them who are paid an hourly rate, and actually comparing that against the total workforce and seeing whether there's avoidance in that way happening.
That's a good point. Great, good, okay, Hench.
You said, thank you again, as everyone else has said, for coming along. Great presentation, really interesting piece of work. You said at the start of your presentation about the kind of increased desire to sort of name and shame companies that have been found to breach. Is there anything in your experience that councils can do to kind of almost reinforce the effect of that? That there's sort of further kind of naming and shaming that be done locally, or whether those companies could be banned from applying for council contracts for 5 years or anything like that?
I think that's a really good point, because who's really looking at that government webpage? I'm not sure your local hairdresser's that bothered really, but they're listed somewhere on 43rd click on the website.
A lot of them were co-signing letters on behalf of the Conservative Party before the election as well, so they obviously weren't that ashamed.
It's hard for me to be a tall person here. I think where that hairdresser might well care if they're all over the front page of the local papers. So there's no reason you can't amplify that message, and if you kept an eye on that government website and every Southwark-based companies appeared on that list, you took it upon yourselves to make their life difficult in the local press. There's absolutely nothing to stop you doing that, and I think the local papers will write it up, and then the business might care.
Okay.
So I think it's a great idea.
Okay, last one from Jasmine.
Yeah, just a proposed action point, Chair. I've got a concept here around open data. It might be one of the things we might want to do is some joint work between our respective councils, your campaign and the open data campaign. Who knows where it may lead us, but
if you give me a concept, let's certainly have a conversation off the back of it and see where that's going.
Excellent, thank you.
Great, and one final thing from me. I don't normally like us doing recommendations where we say we'll write to the government and ask them to do this, because normally it's just frankly a waste of time that they listen to one council. It does seem to me on the issue of devolving responsibility for this, I would assume that actually most councils, irrespective of political persuasion of the administration, would be keen on that. I personally think it's a great idea, and I think it would actually lead to competition between boroughs to be better at this. I wonder whether or not there's a possibility that London councils could coordinate a letter from leaders of London councils to the business secretary, who presumably is the right person to write to because they're in charge of it, and they kind of outsource it to HMRC.
Who's that?
Who's it? Ah, right, okay. Right. So maybe that's something we could do as well. So hopefully Islington would be on board for that.
Yeah. And I'm sure if your leader or mine or Robin from Newham or someone went along to leaders, council, whatever it's called, at London councils and proposed that, they'd be takers.
Great.
I think I don't actually know. I shouldn't. Having said that, I want to be partisan and in that spirit. I don't know what the Conservative attitude to this will be. And it might be quite favourable. I mean, someone like Greg Clark's pretty committed to devolution in other contexts, I think. Whatever, I much prefer him to his predecessor. And when we were doing lobbying work around this, I can't claim to have got very far with the Conservative Party and its manifesto drafted. So actually, it would be a mistake to assume that they'd be anti this idea. And if people have ways in to reach them now, they might be worth exploring because they could be receptive for all I know. And if you could not just get a bunch of London Labour councils calling for this, but a bunch of Conservative councils too, perhaps here or elsewhere in the country, we might get heard.
Great. Good. Okay. This is the last contribution on this.
It's worth putting at London, the GLA.
Yeah.
GLA as well.
Yeah.
I mean,
Okay, great. Well, look, thank you again, Andy, for coming along. I really appreciate it. And we'll be in touch again, I'm sure, to update you on our scrutiny. We'll probably best if we have a 10-minute, or 5-minute break. Let's call it 5 minutes, because we have to change the batteries on the camera. So let's do that, and then come back after we've done it.